if you look at who they were up against, the types of arguments and smears that these people are liable to use, it literally had to be a perfect protest from start to finish.
And like even that lady who got ran over by the horse, the left media was saying, yeah, she threw a bicycle at it and then jumped in front of the horses. It's like, bro, like, and then people are like, oh, she jumped in front of the horses. It's like, bro, like, you use your eyes, like, watch the video. Warm welcome to today's talk. My guest today is Chris Fischer, who is a Canadian expat living here in Mexico. And yeah, we have a very deep conversation on the trucker convoy, as well as a lot of the things that the government has been doing that may be considered a little bit sketchy, a little bit shady, and maybe even you might consider this conversation conspiratorial. But in the interest of open dialogue, if you are kind of like pro-Trudeau, then I would say that you should probably take a look at this video and hear some of the thoughts from Chris. And this is a wonderful conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. To start, just tell me what's going on in Canada. There's an update with Justin Trudeau, so fill me in on this.
8 minutes ago, I just saw this story that was posted 8 minutes ago on CTV News saying that he's actually revoking the Emergencies Act. And I checked my Instagram, and Roman Baber, who I believe you know, he said that it could be because he didn't have the votes in the Senate, which is pretty surprising to me because I was watching some of the Senate debates yesterday, and it seemed like out of the so-called independent senators that were chosen by Trudeau, 90% plus were just adding fuel to the Liberal fire, just adding fuel to the narrative, the race card, the whites, this, and just saying his talking points. So I didn't expect the Senate to be an issue, right? But that's what Roman's saying.
Yeah, I saw this tweet actually from this dude, Supermangella. I don't know if you know him on... Oh, hang on. Okay. All right, yeah, this dude, Supermangella, he made this... he makes all these posts for Roman, and he mentioned pretty much that, like, one of the Senate people were saying, like, hey, we're more balanced, and, like, here's all these people who, like, are in the Senate, so we're actually going to have, like, a more lively debate, and, like, a lot of the reasons that the Emergency Act passed in Parliament, like among the MPs, was because pretty much the NDP said, like, yeah, like, sure, and most people are like morally against it, like that Joel Lightbound or Lightfoot or whatever. He said, he's like, morally I'm against this, but if we shoot this down, then it's going to trigger a non-confidence vote, and then like Trudeau's gone, we have to have another election. Or would he be gone, or what would happen with that? Like,
actually, there would be another election, right? So all those MPs who would be voting on the Emergencies Act, if they vote no, they might lose their jobs and they might lose their pensions. So he's personally threatening their livelihoods and their families to pass this Emergency Act.
Yeah, it's a mess. And like, yeah, I guess what's your whole opinion on everything that went down? Because it was a pretty great couple weeks. Like, I remember when the convoy was on its way to Ottawa, some of these videos, they all had like the waving flag videos, that song, and it actually gave me like hope for the first time, like seeing all these people lined up on the side of highways as it was going, and like everyone was just kind of uniting. And then when they got there, and like Trudeau was like, this is a small fringe minority, and he's like, oh, like, first he denied it was happening, and he's like, it's a small fringe minority with unacceptable views. Yeah. And then when they got there, there was like 50,000 people there, and it was like the streets were filled, and it made me super excited about it. But then they had that one guy with the Nazi flag, which Trudeau likely planted there, and then like he just went on that the whole time. He was just like, yeah, there's Nazis, they're Nazis, like that's it. And
that was his comeback for everything from there on forth. And wasn't it his personal photographer who got those pictures? Pretty fishy.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a picture of his personal photographer there, and yeah, it's like it was frustrating that he was able to use it. It's actually pretty smart in terms of like holding on to power. It's just like a slime.
It is, because it's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's the most effective, because no person who views themselves as a good person would want to stand alongside that. So regardless of whether it's true or not, everybody wants to see themselves as a good person, right? But here's the thing. The protest, they took the moral high ground from the beginning. They said, we're not taking a position on vaccines. We're not taking a position even on, let's say, the Liberal government in general. well, this can all go away. We're just here to end the mandates. And you people are trying to force us to get a shot, which we don't want. And you're segregating us and taking away our livelihoods, which is a moral high ground stance.
Mm-hmm.
And all the people who support that, they can say that they're for equality, they're for workers' rights, they're against fascism. So right off the bat, the moral high ground was with the protesters. This was a very cheap and easy way for him to tell his supporters and to give the media something to grab onto so that they can all look themselves in the mirror and say, hold on, we're not on the bad side here. We can just dismiss them all on the virtue of one picture of one flag. And there might have been other Nazi imagery.
There's like a Confederate flag is another thing that they were talking about.
There was a lot of Trudeau as Hitler stuff,
mm-hmm.
which you can't really say that that's pro-Nazi, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a Confederate flag. There might have been a few Confederate flags. There was definitely at least one guy on the video with the mask who was basically chased away by the freedom protesters.
Mm-hmm.
And there might have been some Confederate flags on the backs of trucks and whatnot. Again, does anybody really believe that the Freedom Convoy was about pro-racism or pro-Nazi anything? Of course not, right? It was pro-freedom, right? Which is powerful, but that's, like you said, that's the cheap and easy way to turn it around and say, no, we're actually still the good guys, even though we have all these fascist policies, because look at their flag.
Mm-hmm. The thing that kind of upset me, though, is because I do go into the comments on Twitter and I look at it, and people actually, like they're saying, Reddit as well. I was like monitoring the Reddit goings on during that whole thing. And people are like, hey, like if you think, like none of the protests I've gone to had Nazi flags in them, it's like if you find yourself in a protest that has Nazi flags or Confederate flags, like maybe you should reflect and realize that you aren't on the right side of history, And it was pretty frustrating to see that it worked,
It worked with a lot of people, but I don't think it worked with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like 100% of liberals said, oh no, actually we're the fascists, let's support the Freedom Convoy, right? But I think there's a percentage that did flip sides.
Yeah.
Because they've never heard these arguments presented in that context before about freedom, equality, people's rights. And it was all peaceful. And if you look at who they were up against, the types of arguments and smears that these people are liable to use, I'm talking about the liberals, I'm talking about the media, I'm also talking about the way the NDP has embraced this woke religious cult. It literally had to be a perfect protest from start to finish, because if there was one incidence of violence, they're fucked.
Mm-hmm.
If there was any actual racism, they would have been totally fucked. So they tried to manufacture the appearance of racism, and that worked with a percentage of people, but I think there's another percentage that came around and woke up.
Mm-hmm.
And then they see around the world all these countries are lifting mandates, and they see that Trudeau's literally prepared to go to war against these protesters with militarized police, with rifles, with sound cannons, with, I don't know if they actually deployed the sound cannons, but they were pointing guns at people, as New York Times reported,
mm-hmm.
which triggered a bunch of Canadian media. And they sprayed people in the face with tear gas, and they beat people with batons, and they trampled them with horses. And people, I think, saw that this isn't the Liberal Party that propaganda has led them to believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
Some people.
Yeah, I just wish it was more, it's like, I like for this whole thing, for this whole pandemic, I was hoping that people would just be able to open their eyes, like look with your eyes, don't look with like what the news is telling you to see. And like even that lady who got ran over by the horse, the media, the left media was saying, yeah, she threw a bicycle at it and then jumped in front of the horses. It's like, bro, like, and then people are like, oh, she jumped in front of the horses. It's like, bro, like, you use your eyes, like, watch the video. Like, how could they?
Because the Ottawa Police Twitter reported that the person threw a bicycle at the horses, and that's
mm-hmm.
when the horses kind of panicked and might have like accidentally trampled some people. They tried to make, but what I noticed was as soon as the Emergency Act got declared, the Ottawa police became extremely aggressive
mm-hmm.
with their threats and with their propaganda. Like, it almost seems like that Ottawa police Twitter handle actually changed hands through this federalization of police powers.
Interesting. Yeah, it's the propaganda aspect of this whole thing has just been, it's been crazy to see. Like,
and I've been on Twitter as well, and I never used to go on Twitter, but I actually made an account just for this because I wanted to just make a difference from here, even though I'm not over there. And it was pretty enlightening. And yeah, there's a lot of hatred against people wanting their freedom. And if you just look at Twitter, and I'm sure Reddit's probably the same, if not worse, more extremely slanted, there's a lot of hatred, but these are not fair-minded people. These are people who have some kind of a personal stake in the liberals maintaining power, or they believe in the wokeness. They're very people who believe in wokeness. They have psychological barriers to not believing in it. It's like if you know someone who's extremely religious, and you're the first person to come into their life and try to talk them out of some of their more extreme elements of their beliefs, you're going to run up against psychological brick walls. And the wokeness is a religion. It's the same thing. It's like the religion of like creating utopia on earth by destroying everything that currently works, right? And they do hold it as a religion, and psychologically it actually inhabits the same part of the psyche that an actual religion does. I see it no differently. So these people who are still defending Trudeau, still attacking the peaceful protests, either they're woke, or in many cases they're actually receiving funds from the government in some way. And you'd be shocked, like a gigantic percentage of the Canadian population somehow receives federal subsidies, or they're paid directly by the government, or they work for some media group that's paid by the government or something. So when you're seeing these people, they're not people who have an open mind, right? Some CBC journalist
yeah, like their job depends on them not seeing this.
Yeah, so the CBC journalist who's attacking the New York Times for what they saw with their own eyes, she's not stating a fair-minded, objective view of the situation, right? And then, like, you know about like foreign influence in Canadian politics.
Yeah.
You know about George Soros. He literally spends billions of dollars to hire armies of activists, and that has to include these Twitter trolls.
And they have these Russian troll farms as well that like their job is just to be doing foreign intervention, and like I'd imagine, you know, it's hard because you don't really know who, like, what's real on the internet anymore. Like, it's crazy. And then actually one of the things, so GoFundMe, they had GoFundMe initially was taking like the Convoy money and like providing it to the Convoy for a percentage, and then they froze the accounts and then said like, hey, we're actually going to give this $9-10 million, however much it was, like to approved charities of GoFundMe. And it's like, bro, what the fuck is that, you know? And then after that they went to like Give, Send, Go, and then the Canadian government just froze that as well. You know, it was pretty fucking crazy to see. Yeah. And yeah, some like random dude hacked it, doxed everyone, and then like now the government is going after people who gave like $20, $50, you know, and freezing their bank accounts. Like, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. It's like all of this can kind of be fixed with open communication, open dialogue. Like if you and I have a disagreement on something, like the way to settle it would probably be by just having a discussion about it, you know, that would make the most sense. But then that kind of goes out the window when one of the parties is actually lying. They don't want open dialogue because they'll get kind of found out. And it's been interesting seeing like Trudeau answering all these questions. Like this dude is like, hey, like you put a ban on like meetups of over 25 people. I see there's more than 25 people here. Indoors, did you get some sort of permit for that? And he's just like, the convoy is illegal, blah blah blah. Just like dodges the question. He's like, yeah, I don't think you understood the question or something. Like, did you get a permit to have more than 25 people here? And then he just dodges the question again. And then like that girl who's like, did you really just call me standing with a Nazi flag? Like my parents died, or like my grandparents died in the Holocaust, and you're telling me like I stand with Nazi flags, like I deserve an apology. And he's like, this is a very serious situation. You know, he just like can't fucking answer a question. It's super You know, like that's not an honest actor if someone has to answer a question like that.
So ask yourself, if you're responsible for the well-being of the country, and clearly having a dialogue with these people would advance the well-being of the country, diffuse tensions, maybe put your own party and your own political self-interest in a better light, because now you're unifying the country instead of dividing it. You'd have to ask yourself, under what circumstances would you refuse that dialogue? And this takes me to these, not theories, but this reality that the Canadian government is connected with international forces, the World Economic Forum.
Mm-hmm.
Chrystia Freeland, the most powerful person in the Canadian government other than Trudeau, some say she's even more powerful, she's on the board. It's a permanent paid salaried position that she's on the board of the World Economic Forum.
And they talk about like the Great Reset as like some conspiracy theory, but the dude who runs the World Economic Forum wrote a book called The Pandemic and the Great Reset.
And he said half the Canadian Parliament is serving his agenda,
mm-hmm.
including Trudeau and including Freeland.
And they also had a thing too where like recently the dude they had like an open question period for the Speaker of the House, and the guy was saying, one of the guys went up, he's like, hey, like this guy said that over half is like in line with the World Economic Forum. Could you for transparency's purposes, could you explain that? And they just cut him off. They're like, the audio was bad.
Yeah.
Super clear audio. It's like, the next question here, like, well, I'm sure it was a great question, but bye. It's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Like,
the question got out, but the answer didn't.
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy what they're doing. But yeah, I guess like you've had COVID, yeah?
I've never been tested, dude. I just treat it like a sickness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna like jump through hoops to say, oh, this is some kind of exceptional thing,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I had COVID. I think I've actually had it at least twice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I still, even after having COVID, people say like, oh, well, if you had COVID, you'd think about this whole thing differently. No.
Mm-hmm.
I still don't want to see my country destroyed.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's weird that that's like on the table, Like we could do that. Yeah, it's like the science in Canada just acts different than the science everywhere else, like Denmark lifted all their restrictions, Ireland lifted all their restrictions, and like can you make a single good argument for why we need a vaccine mandate? Like I've been thinking deeply on the subject, like what would be the benefits of having the vaccine mandate?
Yeah, so if I had to play devil's advocate, I would say Canada has a extremely restrictive healthcare system with limited capacity, which is insufficient to handle a new disease. It's not even sufficient to handle the annual flu season, let alone a new flu, which affects more people. So if you're vaccinated and your symptoms as a result, even though you can still transmit the disease, if your symptoms are not as bad, you're less likely to end up in the hospital, and therefore you're not going to overburden or destroy the healthcare system of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So public healthcare is part of the justification for why we can't be free in Canada.
Yeah. And then in that realm though, it's like Roman Bobber asked that the director of health, like I forget where, Christine Elliott, I think her name is.
In Ontario.
Yeah, in Ontario. He's like, okay, like the issue isn't even beds. Like we have enough beds. The issue's in nursing, but we have, it only takes 4 months to train a regular nurse to become an ICU nurse. So over the past 12 months, how many have you trained? And she just ignored it, So like if the healthcare system's so bad, then it goes back, like it's on the politicians for having not done that, And on top of that, if you don't want to overwhelm it, then why, if it really was about that, why don't they mention vitamin D? Like over 80% of the people who died from COVID were vitamin D deficient. They don't mention exercise. They don't mention healthy diet. They don't mention any of those things. It's literally just like wash your hands, get vaccinated for one, and then wear a mask. And so
and stay inside, don't get any sun, don't interact socially, destroy your mental health.
Yeah, so it's just like So if that's the case, you know, it's like even the last lockdown, I was actually in Canada for it, and over 80% or 90% of people are vaccinated. It's like, if you need to do the lockdown because you're going to overwhelm the hospitals, then do it. But you guys should also all like step down after this and say, like, we failed you over the past 2 years. We didn't like hospital capacity was what they were crying about 2 weeks in. Like, that's why we had 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Mm-hmm. So why
is
after,
pretty deep.
Why after 2 years do they still not have hospital capacity?
I'd say number one, public health and big pharma cannot be separated in Canada. In fact, a lot of doctors and big pharma can't be separated. If you're a doctor in Canada, your earnings are capped. Okay, there's no way to make more money by being a better doctor. The only way to make more money by being a better doctor is either A, to leave Canada, or if you want to make more money, you need to make deals with companies to sell their product, right? So at the end of the year, if a doctor can show up at the annual Pfizer meeting in St. Kitts, and they talk to the rep and they say, oh, here's like 5,000 subscriptions that I filled out in the last year for your products, probably they're going to get invited to the next cruise or the next all-inclusive vacation, or maybe they'll get a car or something like that. I know this, right? This is how a lot of things operate. These doctors go to these conferences that are sponsored by big pharma. And then there's the fact that there's just no incentive to do a better job. And the more of a problem there is, the solution is always going to be throw more money at the problem. So what's the incentive to fix the healthcare system? Well, one possible incentive is a giant public backlash, which is starting to happen now. But until now, Canadians in general, they're not like Americans, okay? Americans are very political. They're very, some would say, like, aggressive with their defense of their rights and making sure that their politicians are held accountable and whatnot. In Canada, the mindset is we don't even really pay attention to what they're doing. It's their job. We're in the best country in the world, so trust the experts. And so there's not that accountability. It's like reverse incentives. The worse you do, the more money you get, and there's no people to hold them accountable. I think that's changing now. Mm-hmm. With the Freedom Convoy, there's been millions of people who have come together through these alternative social media networks like the Freedom Convoy Instagram page and the Facebook group and different Twitter feeds. And because of that new ecosystem, there's going to be a lot of information that gets shared in the absence of the media, and I think there's going to be a greater degree of accountability going forward. And the power of the mainstream media has been significantly diminished by this, right? So that's the other group that could, in theory, hold these bureaucrats or politicians accountable, would be the media. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, they have the same incentives as the corrupt politicians and bureaucrats do. So it needs to be a grassroots uprising, just like what we've had. And I don't know to what extent it's going to correct the problem, or if the establishment's just going to double down and keep on calling them terrorists like they basically try to do until now. But it's made a difference, right? And even if you just look at elections and popular votes, the fact that there's millions of people now in these groups and following these pages, it's a big counterbalance to the mainstream narrative. And it's a great way for people to actually share real information amongst themselves to hold some of these people accountable.
Yeah. I hope it works, you know, like I hope it actually makes a change. My main issue with the thing, so I made my first anti-lockdown video December 2020. And I actually had like 15,000 plus views on it, and like a lot of people shared it. Like doctors actually like booked calls with me to discuss like my views on it. But then the issue that I'm kind of finding, and actually I spoke with Roman Bauer about this as well, is you're kind of just hitting the same audience over and over. So now it's like people who already agree with you, you know? And it's kind of like, fuck, like, I don't know, like with popular opinion, that, or like public opinion, that's the only way that anything can get done. So it's kind of like, I guess my thoughts on the thing is like, how do we actually reach these people who are just like drones, and they still believe like Trudeau, even though like with their own eyes they look at this guy who can't answer a question straight, like how do they sit there and trusting this man?
Well, because his voters don't pay attention. I think in the majority of cases, these voters of Trudeau's are just straight up not paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
They're not watching the full question period. They're not seeing these debates take place in real time. At best, they're watching the 6 o'clock news or the 11 o'clock news, and they get a 5-second soundbite so they can hear Trudeau talking about how we have each other's backs and we all love each other, therefore we need mandates and lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a certain percentage of the population that's going to resonate with that message, especially coming from a guy like Trudeau, right? I think the Freedom Convoy, so what you're talking about is like an iron curtain of like information firewall, right? Because the media has its narrative. They weren't taking any of this into account. Anything Roman Bobber said or anything that's been said through your videos or other people's videos on YouTube and whatnot. It had to be, you've seen V for Vendetta?
Yeah, I just watched it and I was like, it predicted this perfectly.
So this girl was so asleep that she had to be kidnapped and tortured to wake up.
Mm-hmm.
The Freedom Convoy was like a traumatic shock to the country, which broke down the Iron Curtain.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it wasn't covered fairly 100%, let's say 60 to 70% of the coverage was flawed propaganda, it still broke through the curtain. It still made people see things they wouldn't have otherwise ever seen, these arguments, these opinions in their whole life. Now if you look at Justin Trudeau's Twitter, the top 1,000 comments are all like, you have no right to talk about Russia, look what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Which I'm liking that, actually. That's actually something that I saw with Doug Ford as well. I used to follow him on Instagram, and all of his comments were just people who hated him. You know, there's no one on his side anymore. But that was one of the things with Twitter that I was seeing, is there are like, I don't even know, they could be bots, but like, this is the best prime minister ever, you know, this is who we need for this situation. It's like, bro, like, come on, he's not good at anything, you know, like he was a drama teacher. He's
a good actor.
Yeah, that's it. Like and like people legitimately believe he's the son of Fidel Castro, and he might be, you know. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess. But yeah, I'm kind of hoping that the Freedom Convoy did what it was, you know, like I hope it made an impact, but I don't know.
Look at the provinces.
Yeah. Oh, that's the cool thing as well too, is that they're like, yeah, like this had no impact, but like since it started, Aaron O'Toole is gone. Now we actually have conservatives who believe that like we need to lift all mandates, all these things, and then Saskatchewan, Alberta all lifted theirs. Quebec canceled their like vaccine tax that they were going to have. So it did. Yeah, you're right.
Ontario's like 6 days away from getting rid of their vaccine passport.
So there's a little piece of the conversation missing right now, mostly due to us saying something that could be interpreted as illegal. So I've actually cut that. But without further ado, here is the rest of the interview. So I'm actually fully vaccinated, you know, like when I went there, I went and got vaccinated. So I actually got it, but I needed that to get out of the country. But then I deleted it after that. Like, I don't want to live in a country where I need to show papers of vaccination, you know, like, unless I'm showing my fucking polio vaccine, unless I'm showing that I got, like, my tetanus shot, flu shot I haven't got for 10 years, so why the fuck do I need to show this thing that, you know, like, if you say you want to see the polio vaccine shot, at least you know if I have the polio vaccine shot, the chances of me having polio are pretty fucking low, you know, versus if I have the COVID vaccine shot, the chances I have COVID are the exact same as if I didn't get the shot. So, like, according to Pfizer CEO himself.
Yes. And the one person I know who got the most sick from COVID, double vaccinated. The people who are the most afraid of getting COVID or dying of COVID, it's all the people who are fully vaccinated and boosted. Who's more scared of COVID? Who's more scared of them personally suffering from COVID? Somebody who's fully protected with all the boosters, or somebody who has no protection whatsoever because they're unvaccinated? Somehow the boosted people are more worried about dying than the non-boosted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw this thing on Reddit. This girl was actually like in the Playa del Carmen subreddit saying that she's coming on vacation. She's like, so I know, like, I'm Canadian and I'm triple vaccinated, so I know I'm not the problem. But there's like, Americans are able to go. Like, should I just avoid people who are American, like the plague, you know, like ... like the plague, you know? And she was like kind of making it a joke, and everyone in the comments is like, bro, just stay home. Like, you're fucking triple vaccinated. Why are you so worried about this thing?
Yeah, like at this point, you just stay home forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the unfortunate parts of this. Like, it's destroyed this entire upcoming generation of people, kind of. You know, like all the kids who need social activity, they're not going to get it. You know, they're going to. It's crazy.
There seems to be a mindset in Canada where if something is a good idea in theory, therefore the government needs to make it mandatory. And I think that's a very dangerous mindset. Because if you think staying at home is a good idea, or if you think wearing a mask is a good idea, or getting quadruple boosted, that's great. Nobody is ever going to stop you from doing those things.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like such a natural leap for these people to go from, I think it's a good idea, therefore people should suffer if they don't want to do it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It should be mandatory. Like that leap is something that I think exists in Canada to a much greater degree than the US, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as well, like you're seeing these, like the Super Bowl just had 70,000 plus people at it, you know, and like everywhere else, Europe's just lifting all their mandates and everything's going back to normal. Like I think tomorrow in the UK, by the time this is up, the pandemic is officially over in UK, and they said like, hey, like take whatever precautions you want, but we're not going to be forcing you to do anything. And I just, it's frustrating to see that like people in Canada, they're like, oh, like the 70,000 people, like, yeah, like they can, you know, they're probably mad about it, but like they're just able to see like, oh, like they're allowed to have 70,000 people, but I can only go to the grocery store and I need to avoid everyone.
Well, with a lot of these liberals, they're actually anti-American to the point where if the US is doing something, therefore we need to be better than them by being different than them. So if the US embraces freedom, how do we differentiate ourselves? By being there for each other and having each other's backs with fascist mandates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like, and people want unvaccinated people to die, you know? It's like, I don't like to compare this to the Holocaust or whatever, but I mean, a lot of these people would be loading Jews onto trains and be like, it's like, you're going to go into the forest so you don't like...
It's a perfect comparison to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're hurting people in a way that's socially acceptable and encouraged by your government and your media.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing like who actually has morals and who can just go with the crowd that wants to hurt a minority of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've always thought about it like, hey, it's interesting, you know, like I wonder what it would have been like, you know? And now I know. It's like, because even like the Americans who are fighting against the Nazis in World War II, then they come back and they have separate drinking fountains for black people. You know, they have separate restaurants where only white people are allowed to go because black people need to be separated for the good of society. And it's like they were able to, like, there's this cognitive dissonance where they were like, okay, them doing these things to the Jews is bad, but then we're also going to also segregate a portion of the population here, and they don't see the hypocrisy in that,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And then, yeah, that's like, everyone can agree what they did to the Jews was bad, but then it's like, but you're also pro-segregation here, you know, like, because of like a vaccine.
Yep. Well, before the convoy, all the momentum was in favor of we need more restrictions on the unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
We need more mandates, not less mandates. What should we do with these dirty people who take up space? And
should we tolerate them?
Should we even tolerate them?
Yeah.
Like, what do we do with them? Do we just like lock them in a camp, or like they're dirty? We have to get rid of them, right? And that was the mainstream dialogue as of like mid-January, like literally a fucking month ago. That was literally the mainstream dialogue. And the Freedom Convoy changed that from changed the narrative from are we restricting these dirty people enough to are we lifting mandates quickly enough? And are we still in line with the rest of the civilized world? And is this fascism or is this not fascism, what we're doing to these people? So massive explosion of the prior narrative and like transformation of that into something more sensible.
Where do you think Canada's going to be like 5 years from now?
That's a tough one. Well, let's take the optimistic view here, because I think we've reached a critical mass to where they can't stop this movement. Best case scenario, even if they had the Emergency Act for 30 days, they would be stuck in more and more difficult positions trying to justify it over time. Now you have international media pointing the spotlight at Canada and saying, like, what the fuck is going on here? New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Now, and previous to that, it was a lot of like Sky News and Fox News and whatnot. But now it's people on both sides of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So they could have tried to go against what the world is doing by not lifting mandates and adding new ones, and become an international embarrassment to an even greater extent than they have with this Emergencies Act. But they would just face more and more resistance each step of the way. And millions of people are now mobilized in Canada against this agenda. So it's debatable if they would have even had the votes in the Senate, despite the fact that Trudeau appointed partisans.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably what's going to happen is there's going to be not an election yet in Canada, but within 2 to 3 years, I think there's going to be an election, and I think the Conservatives are going to win.
Mm-hmm. We need that was another thing I was actually worried about, because if they say like we can't do the Emergency Act, which I think it was funny because he enforced the Emergency Act, and then they were going to debate it on the Friday, but they couldn't debate it because of the actions of the police in Ottawa taking everyone out was too dangerous for them to be in Parliament at the time, so they couldn't debate, because they're doing this thing that like is fascism and totalitarianism. But I was worried about it because if they call a new election, we don't have a leader in the Conservative Party right now, so fucking Trudeau may very well once again win an election if they like call another one right now, which is kind of frustrating to see.
I saw a poll which had the Conservatives ahead of the Liberals,
Mm-hmm.
338. And I actually think that if Candice Bergen had been the Conservative leader instead of Erin O'Toole in the last election, I think the Conservatives would have won.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing if Pierre Poilievre would have been the leader.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know Candice before this, but she's my girl. I like that girl a lot. But yeah, then Pierre, I heard of Pierre because he was talking shit on lockdowns like early 2021. He's like, hey, like the Blue Jays are playing but in America, and they're bringing all of that money to America because we're just fucked, like we aren't allowed to have anything. So yeah, I kind of hope that he becomes the guy and he becomes PM, or yeah, I'm not sure. And pretty much anyone, as long as we have like some strong leader in the Conservatives to take out.
I agree, man, because if Trudeau would have been called out for the unethical things he was doing, he would have lost.
Mm-hmm.
Erin O'Toole didn't do that. Erin O'Toole, his argument about these mandates was basically, I agree with you, Trudeau. You're right, but I'm just not as strong as you. Right? I agree with you that we need these mandates, but if some like weird idiot doesn't want to get vaccinated, we'll still let them get tested like 1 million times and still fuck with them, but not completely destroy their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So he basically gave the moral high ground away and then just tried to like weasel his way into some kind of middle ground, which didn't work.
Yeah, exactly. And we need that strong opposition. Like it's, otherwise you're just sitting there in an echo chamber where it's like the NDP is they talk shit on Justin Trudeau, but then they're like, oh, like, but yeah, like we're against the Freedom Convoy. It's like the party of the workers. It's supposed to be. It's like, yeah, it's a super weird thing, like Antifa, like anti-fascist is siding with fascism. And then like the party of the workers is against a bunch of truck drivers and tractor controllers, like they're against the workers. Like the workers party is against workers, like the proletariat actually has like the means to make a change, and they're like, Trudeau, like emergency act, like we support it. So yeah, it's been a wild.
Yeah, when workers' rights come into conflict with the woke cult in the NDP, you see where their allegiance truly lies.
Mm-hmm.
It could be because he's in the World Economic Forum, Jagmeet. It could be because...
Also Pierre is too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah, and...
Stephen Harper was too, by the way.
Yeah.
Which is not as penetrated as these liberals are,
mm-hmm.
maybe.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but yeah, so it's like... It's kind of like we could be fucked, you know? We could just... Looking 10 years into the future, if they're pushing this agenda, you know? It's like Venezuela was... one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the 90s, and now like you can't even go there, you know.
I've never been as optimistic about Canada's future as I was about the US,
mm-hmm.
because the people have a different mindset. They're much more on the side of pro-authoritarianism, and there's less checks and balances. The politicians have way more power,
mm-hmm.
and the population isn't as politically savvy as in other countries. They still fall victim to these like virtue signaling arguments, or just blanket statement calling your enemies racists or whatever. That actually still works in Canada, maybe to
mm-hmm.
an even greater extent than in the US. And just the way the power is concentrated, like we don't really have a functioning Senate.
Mm-hmm.
The courts are pretty much appointed by the Prime Minister. The Senate's appointed by the Prime Minister. The provinces all get money from the federal government. The media all gets money from the federal government. The public sector is like 40% of the economy, so everyone's getting their back scratched by this big government shit in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really look at it, it's like it is a centralization of power, and a majority government is like an elected dictatorship in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So there's very few checks and balances. So all you need is some charismatic guy who can deceive people for a few years, and you can destroy your whole country just like that.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we're currently at. But it's interesting because he's not charismatic, you know, like
he's not charismatic, but he still is in the lead in the polls with with female votes.
Fuck. Yeah, it's so frustrating because
he's an actor,
mm-hmm.
and he's able to emote on demand, if you know what I mean. Like
mm-hmm.
he's able to display emotion on demand, which he's practiced over the years. Because if you look at his videos from 7-8 years ago, when he's talking, he's awkward as fuck.
Mm-hmm.
And the more emotional he tries to get, the more awkward it looks. But he's actually managed to correct his acting style over the past 8 years to where it actually does convince a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's all acting.
Yeah.
He's reading a script. Have you ever seen those videos of him in the G20 where it's just a room full of people and he has to go and just talk to people without a script, and it's like just free flowing and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And he just stands there with his hands in his pockets and he's looking around, not sure who to talk to, and can't really get into a conversation, and nobody respects him. That's like Trudeau in an organic environment where he doesn't have a script.
Mm-hmm.
Or he says shit like, I admire the dictatorship of China. It's the country I admire the most. It's like,
because they're able to turn their economy around on the dime because they're able to, like, they can just control everything. Like, they can just force people to do whatever.
Yeah, a rare moment of honesty, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he was off script.
And it came back to fuck him, you know? Like, so that's probably why he's like, just give me a script and I will only say what's on the script so that no one can have anything against me. But yeah, his actual thoughts are, no one knows what his thoughts are. It's just...
The country he admires the most is a literal genocidal totalitarian dictatorship with one party rule and basically permanent power for the guy who's in charge, Xi. It's like, that's like your model of... And then he's tried to say, I saw the full clip, he tried to say like, oh, I'm sure Harper's dreaming about having these powers. It's like, are you sure it's Harper? Are you sure it's not you? Because you're the one who just said that you admire them more than any other country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he can't say the U.S. because his base wouldn't like that very much, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the second he could get some power, he's taking advantage of it, and he's, you know, it's crazy to see. He just keeps pushing for more and more and more, and that's kind of what we've seen over the pandemic. It's like they seem to have just taken it. I think it happened by accident. This whole thing started. And I was on board with stuff for like the first 2-3 weeks. I was like, yeah, like this all makes sense. Like, we've never heard of this before. I don't know what the fuck's going on. And he's like, hey, like, we're gonna, you know, like, stay inside, blah, blah, we'll get through this together. I actually believe that. And then things just started not adding up for me. And so then I feel like this whole thing since then has kind of been an exercise in how far can we go and people will still allow it.
Yes, 100%. It's been a giant social experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's videos of Klaus Schwab saying just as much, saying like, I don't know, something like word for word almost. We've seen through the pandemic how adaptive humans can be to different living conditions, and this gives us a lot of hope that we can build back better with the Great Reset, which is you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. So basically, all we have to, so it's like these people have enjoyed freedom for the last like few hundred years or whatever, but they don't need that,
Mm-hmm.
right? We could easily just put them into like 200 square foot coffin apartments, have them own nothing, give them some weed to smoke and some other pharmaceutical drugs and whatnot, stimulate their biological needs through whatever pornography and whatever other means, and they'll feel like they're happy, and they won't even know the difference. They won't even remember what life was like before, because
Mhm.
these humans, their brains have such neuroplasticity that we can do anything to them and they'll accept it.
One of the things as well I was noticing, because I'm super against the vaccine mandates, and I was like crying about it. I'm like, I don't like, I could have gotten a QR code here. It was offered to me numerous times. I could have bought one. But like for my parents' sake, they're like, hey, like we want you to be vaccinated. I was like, all right, like I did the research. I was like, yeah, you know what, fuck it. Like I'll get the actual vaccine. But I don't want to give this vaccine passport. But then one of the things I've been thinking, it's like, but when I want to leave the country, I need to show an actual passport. And that was kind of made me rethink, like, am I against all government at this point? Like, am I against even showing a travel passport? Like, why do we have that even?
Interesting. Well, it's definitely pushing people to a new threshold, which they haven't been pushed to with just a regular passport.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, even the passport was pushing people to a greater degree, right?
Yeah.
And people adapted to that. But I think there's a certain line where you start forcibly injecting people or taking their rights away. As we've seen with the Freedom Convoy, I'm sure Klaus Schwab is very disappointed. These humans aren't quite as adaptive as we thought they might have been.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been other experiments like this, like the Milgram experiment,
What was that?
where they basically told somebody from the street, some random person, we need a volunteer for an experiment, and we need to run an experiment on like humans' pain thresholds. So there's going to be somebody in a room, you can't see them. We need you to press a button and keep pressing the button when the scientist tells you to, and we're just going to like measure scientifically how the person reacts to the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And they explain to them like, and once you pass this voltage, it can cause long-term damage, but I'm in charge of the experiment. So even once you pass that threshold, just keep on pushing the button as long as I tell you to push it. And they saw that a lot of humans, it was like over half were, I don't know the exact number, so I don't want to slander the human race or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the Milgram experiment. And a shocking amount of people would kill the participant. They would have someone in the room screaming, begging for mercy, like, I'm going to die, please, stop. And then people would be squirming, they'd be nervous, they'd be like, I don't know what I should do. And the scientist would be like, press the next button, 500 volts. And they would press it, and they would literally kill the person in the experiment.
Mm-hmm.
That was one. And then the Stanford prison experiment, they put like 30 people in a prison. Half of them became the guards, half of them became the prisoners, and they wanted to see what would happen. And within a few days, the guards were just like beating the prisoners, locking them down, taking their food away and whatnot, just because the warden gave them permission to. These are people who did nothing wrong. It was part of a fucking experiment.
And they were just randomly selected to be
Yeah.
the guards, They had just as much of an opportunity to be the prisoners as well.
So when Klaus Schwab says things like, we've seen how adaptive the human race is through the pandemic, it's like he's watching to see how far he can advance this great reset of you will own nothing and you'll be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And Canada's been in some version of that for a long time. So there was Agenda 21, then there was Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset. And even that was about, can we put this population of people who's used to having houses with backyards, can we put them into tiny boxes in the sky, and will they accept that? And I guess you could say they did, right? People have mental health issues, people have drug addictions, people have higher levels of depression than before. Maybe evidence that there are some effects of these agendas, some downsides, but people still tolerated that. They didn't riot, and that's pretty covert. This lockdown mandate shit is pretty much less covert. Like, it's, the tyranny's more in your face.
Yeah, I guess they thought that, hey, like, the people who support this, they're like militant on it, you know? So it's pretty much whatever we say.
Oh yeah, so we'll divide the population
exactly.
between the good guys and the bad guys.
Which is actually something that Trudeau, I was looking for this earlier. I checked Google though, so Google's not a reliable source of information anymore. But I was trying to find it. I'll find it later. But like Trudeau was talking to someone. He's like, yeah, like what we've learned is you can actually rule a country by division and polarity, and then you like pit the two people against each other, and you're good to go. You know, like you can actually win like that. And it's like, fuck, bro. Like
you saw it on Twitter. People will call out Trudeau for his fascist behavior. And there's going to be a bunch of trolls that are going to jump to his defense immediately, because it's playing on people's desire for social status and sexual market value as well. Because what they're doing is they're promising people a higher sexual market value and social status if they comply. So we're going to create two castes of people. So social credit score, right? It's a score of 1,000. This is a social credit score, but it's, you get 1,000 if you're fully vaccinated, or you get 0 if you're not fully vaccinated. And if you have 1,000 or 1 versus 0, you can have all the rights in the world. You can go to restaurants. You can basically be a superior class of human being. So it's a bargain with the devil, and a lot of people took that bargain. However, even a lot of vaccinated people will not take that bargain, right? But I'm sure they like the dynamic of, when people try to attack them, there's like millions of lemmings who just jump to their defense and start attacking anyone who wants to be free.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. And it's crazy that like they didn't watch this episode of Black Mirror, which goes into the social credit system and how like horrible it can go for people. And they're actually able to, like that social credit system episode of Black Mirror, it wasn't a good thing, you know? They weren't saying like this is awesome, but then they're still trying to implement it, you know? And like I remember when that episode came out, they're like, they actually have something like that in China, and everyone's like, no fucking way, like that's a real thing. And they're actually, you know, they're sort of pushing towards it. And I'm kind of afraid that like our kids, my future kids, your existing kids, they'll be growing up in a world where that could become normal to them. Maybe not our kids. We'll talk to them like, hey, by the way, like here's what it was like before the winter, you know, like before this all happened. Like you didn't need to show this to go somewhere, you know. You didn't need to wear a mask that has no scientific efficacy for being used. Like you could just live your life. And our kids might not have to deal with it, but like there will be a large percentage of people who will grow up knowing nothing but that, and they're like, oh yeah, like if I say anything wrong, I just like my credit score gets docked, my bank accounts can get frozen by the government for donating a little bit of money to a convoy against mandates, you know, against government overreach. And then the government responds to that by overreaching more and freezing their fucking bank accounts.
Yeah, well, people are going to say on the other side, I followed all the rules, I'm a good citizen, why shouldn't I be rewarded? Why should I be in the same boat as somebody who's a bad person? Yeah,
I wish it didn't work, you know, like I wish people were smarter and they could just see that.
They don't see that it's enslaving them. The more they comply, the more they're actually getting caught in the fucking web, this like spider web of tyranny.
And then where do you say no, you know? And that's the thing as well against mandates. It's like, okay, you're mandating this for the hospital thing, but what about obese people? What about smokers? Like, and they when they were talking about this new pill that they're going to like Theresa Tam was like, yeah, we're gonna have to prioritize it for the unvaccinated because like they're gonna be getting the sickest anyway with COVID, so we're gonna have to give it to them. And someone else is like, well, yeah, she says that, but I don't think that's a good idea because like those people didn't do their part, and now we're using up hospital resources to deal with the fact that these people didn't like do what everyone else did, and now they're like ruining our healthcare system, you know. But it's like at what point do we start blaming obesity? Like diabetes is also like one of the main comorbidities that makes COVID really bad. Like they don't talk about that.
Yep.
You know, like smoking, like you fucking did it to yourself, you know, like it's a very slippery slope because it's like, well, I mean, cigarettes, like those cigarette companies were paying pharmaceutical companies like doctors to say like, this is the healthiest cigarette.
Yeah.
And then people trusted them because they were doctors. And then those people smoked, and then now they can't advertise for it, but then like it got into public awareness, like the zeitgeist of society, like smoking's cool. And then like, so is it even your fault if you smoke? Or is it the fault of these companies? You know, so like it's a weird thing where it's sort of, it's all going down, so then it just doesn't make sense. Like you can't really blame yourself for smoking. I guess you could because you're like, you know, you're an adult, so fucking quit. But
can you blame yourself for taking a potentially harmful vaccine?
That's
right?
The thing as well. Like,
let's say those have negative health effects.
They do.
Are we going to blame the vaccinated people next?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, we don't know if the vaccine is causing the variants, you know, like it could be based on, you know, it's like, why don't you want to take antibiotics? Or like when you get a round of antibiotics, make sure you take all of them, because if you don't, then like say you have like a 10-day thing and you only take 7 days worth, you'll kill all the weaker ones, but then you'll have like, you won't have killed that last strong bacteria, and then that thing's going to propagate, and that's going to create more antibiotic resistant molecules and bacteria. So it's like, this is something that's been known for ever.
So do we want to live in a world where we're having these absurd arguments about who the good people are and who's entitled to healthcare and who's not entitled to healthcare?
Mm-hmm.
I personally prefer to live in a world where everybody's free to do what they want, and then they live with the consequences. And eventually, through millions of people doing that, like we can see what is healthy and what's unhealthy. You can look at other people and say, hey, like, I want to be like that person, so I'm going to make healthier choices because I can see that that person's healthy. You know, the debate doesn't have to be like, do we deny healthcare to obese people or not non-vaxxed or vaxxed? Because that takes you down a very slippery slope of dominoes, which ends with complete absurdities, which I would argue, like, we're already in an absurd phase where we were talking about a month ago in Canada denying healthcare from unvaccinated people. So would you rather live in that world where we're always fighting over like who controls the government and who's going to hold the gun and point it at their enemies, and if you lose, like, that's a fucking civil war, dude.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the convoy was fully peaceful, but the government pushed people and pushed them until they had no other options but to literally go to the Parliament building and to park their trucks and to say, hey, we're not leaving until this gets fixed.
Yeah.
That's not what they wanted to be doing. This is a result of months and years of pushing people, like we were saying with the Klaus Schwab and how far can we push people before they fight back? They literally pushed them until they had no other option.
Mm-hmm.
What did he think was going to happen? Did he think that it would get to a point where they locked them all in a camp? Or where some percentage of the population would eventually fight back? You know, there was no other way to get through it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, either we have to put these people in camps because they don't like being oppressed, they don't like the way they're being treated, and they're about to start fighting back. How do we deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
Do we just give them their freedom back? No, we can't do that. Let's put them in a camp. Let's declare martial law. Let's have military with rifles pointing it at peaceful protesters because they won't comply. It's like, they caused this.
Mm-hmm. How close do you think we're getting to like concentration camps for unvaccinated people?
I'd say at this point we're a lot further away from it than we were a month ago.
Mm-hmm. I guess, yeah, before the convoy. I like how optimistic you are on the convoy. Like, I started super optimistic about it, but I guess my part of it is just like, it's so abundantly clear that it's the right thing, but then I can also see a lot of people who don't, like, who are just viciously against the convoys and viciously against like people standing up like, hey, we're not going to get mandated, and they can't see the problem with it. That I'm kind of pessimistic because they're like, it's allowing the agenda of Trudeau and the WEF to kind of keep going forward when if you just open your eyes and like use your brain cells, then you would know that that's not the direction you want to head.
It's easy to get that impression from Twitter and Reddit.
Yeah.
But that's not a representative sample of the entire population, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a self-selecting group that tends to be young, tends to be angry, tends to have a lot of time on their hands because blue-collar people or working class or private people who work in the private sector, they have to provide value to keep their jobs. They can't be on Twitter while they're getting paid. They don't go to a university class 2 hours a day and then have to kill time the rest of the day after having their brains filled with woke crap,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and then they go on Twitter and lash out at people who want their freedom, right? So the hashtag blackface Hitler was trending #1 in Canada on Saturday evening and on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
By the time Monday and Tuesday came around, all the top trendings were pro-Trudeau. Like Trudeau was right, was the #1 trending during weekdays.
Mm-hmm.
So you even look at how the hashtags that trend #1 varies from weekends to weekdays when private sector people are working versus when private sector people are off. And consider the fact that most of these pro-Trudeau people, they don't have jobs like that, you know? They don't have like jobs where they have to provide value or get fired.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing a lot of these people don't realize is how fucking privileged they are. And then to say that they represent the working class is such an insult to all these people. Like
Mm-hmm. And to call everyone who's not vaccinated a racist when like 40% of the native population is unvaccinated, it's like...
it shouldn't even matter though.
Mm-hmm, it shouldn't. But it's
The
kind of
freedom-
like, it's like minorities have a history of getting fucked by the government, you know, medically.
Yeah.
You know, like the Tuskegee experiment.
Mhm.
Like that's crazy. Crazy what they were doing. They only did that. They did that up until the 70s, where they're just like not treating syphilis in black people because they're just seeing what happens. And the only reason they stopped it was because they got caught, you know? And so like these minority groups, they have a reason to be hesitant about things, you know, about like government forced vaccinations and government interventions, you know? But then, yeah, then the go-to from that side is if you don't do it, it's because you're racist. You know, it's just such a fucking weird stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I'd say the Freedom Convoy, like the racial makeup was more or less the same as the general Canadian population.
Mm-hmm.
But the crazy thing is that most visible minorities in Canada are new. They're immigrants. They don't know the history of Canada. They don't know the culture of Canada. They don't have the same like... So Canada has like a pretty free history compared to a lot of countries. There was way more freedom in Canada 30 years ago than there was in like France or Britain, let's say, or India or China or, you know, most other parts of the world where we're drawing our immigrants from. So sadly, a lot of what these people know about Canada is just what they hear in the schools, in the universities, and from the media. And that's where they get their idea of Canada from. So they can literally just rewrite the history of Canada to be whatever they want it to be. And chances are there's still more freedom in Canada than where these people came from. So the country could be destroyed in front of their eyes and they would see it as not a bad thing, not a downgrade.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there was a lot of minorities who joined the Freedom Convoy and who don't want fucking tyranny in the country.
Mm-hmm.
One of them just walked right into the apartment right here. So it was representative of the general population. So probably it was around 70-80% white people. There was Indian people, there were black people and whatnot. But I guess the only type of protest that the leftists approve of is like literal racial protests where it's like only a minority group protesting.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're protesting against a pipeline because it goes through your reserve, or if you're protesting because black people are disproportionately abused by police, that's okay. But if you want freedom for everybody, something that can actually unify the population against a tyrannical government, that's way out of line.
Yeah, it's these what is an acceptable protest versus, you know, like, well, all protests should be acceptable, you know? But to just point this one as like, hey, these people just want basic human rights. It's like, fuck them, you know? It's pretty crazy. But yeah, actually, like, I like your optimism on this freedom convoy, and I think I need to be more focused on the good here. You know, like I was saying, like we have this hope. You know, like it gave me hope for the first time that things are turning around. And yeah, you're right. There was a ton of different things that changed. Like most of the mandates were dropped. I guess my issue with the situation
Or they
was
said they were going to drop
yeah,
them.
but yeah, and it's like they didn't eliminate the ability to reinstate them. You know, that's the issue that I'm having. You know, and that's why I'm having the problem with like they're not dropping it federally. And I was saying like you can't leave the country, even though like you can. But I don't like the idea of even needing to go like fucking buy a vaccine QR code. Like I don't like that I have to do that.
Of course.
You know, I hate that because there's no justification for it, you know.
I have unvaccinated people in my family.
Mm-hmm.
The only way for them to leave is to escape.
Yeah, exactly.
How fucked is that? How can anybody in Canada claim that freedoms and rights haven't been taken away when the freedom to cross the fucking border has been taken away from millions of people? You know, they say like with bullying, it's like the bystander has responsibility to stop the bully.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, these bystanders are not stopping the bully. They're cheering him on because they think it gives them higher status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I guess it's sort of seeing it's kind of, I guess it's just a bunch of people with no meaning in their life, and they're just like, yeah, like you were saying, it increases your sexual market value, it increases your position in society, apparently, you know. For a very short-term thinking person, it does.
It's an unconscious thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the vast majority of these people, if you notice, they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about the future. They don't really spend a lot of time thinking about having families or kids or grandkids. You know, most of these people are just perfectly content to maybe have a dog, a couple cats,
Yeah.
be comfortable in society. They're scared of catching COVID. They want the government to make them feel safe. And they don't think about the society that they're creating, right? They don't have that perspective, that long-term vision for society. And then if I look at a lot of these people individually, they don't even have a long-term vision for themselves. So how the fuck can they have a long-term vision for a whole society? It's not possible for them.
Yeah, and they're just trying to get like internet points by being rude to people. But yeah, like unlocks this thing. It's like, wait, I can express hatred to these people and I'm going to socially be accepted for it, you know? And then they just get more and more extreme, you know? Like people are like, hey, like if you're unvaccinated, like I hope you die. It's like, bro, what the fuck? Like,
it's a phenomenon in authoritarian or totalitarian communism where they implement tyranny with this grand promise of, we need this tyranny, but it's only for a little bit, and we're all going to come off way better on the other side of it. But then the deeper they get into the agenda, the worse things get, and they have to find scapegoats to explain why things aren't working the way the government promised they would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was that. One of the most blatant aspects of this was the mask mandates, you know, and they're like, hey, like, yeah, you have to wear this mask. When they finally did do studies, the like most masks do nothing, and then like the N95s, they like prevented a little bit, you know, but then they finally were like, okay, like with Omicron, these masks do nothing, but then they just kept they still have the mask mandate, you know. It's like you need to wear a mask, but I can go to the store with any fucking like a t-shirt that I cut up and throw it over my face and that'll be okay. I can't tie a t-shirt around my face. Like I've tried that before when I like didn't have a mask. Like, no, you can't do that. But it just doesn't make any fucking sense. Like so it's not about health, you know? It's like about pushing this.
When you walk into a church, you know, a Catholic church at least, you dip your hand in the holy water, you make the sign of the cross, you genuflect, and then you walk in. It's like when you walk into a store, you reach into your pocket, you put on your mask, you know that everybody who's in that store, you know, they believe the same morals as you do.
Mm-hmm.
You see someone wearing a mask in the street, you know that they're on board with your cult as well.
Yeah.
Kind of like if you see somebody with like a religious ornamentation on. So there's these rituals that humans can be taught to perform which don't have a scientific basis. And the fact that the world has been globalized, and obviously in different parts of the world we speak different languages, we have different religions and whatnot. But the one unifying story, the one unifying narrative for 2 years was COVID. It became the worldwide religion for 2 years. And that's powerful because, look, you meet someone new. Let's say they're from a different country, or maybe you're just meeting them for the first time. Maybe they're from your country. What do you talk about? It's like, well, the one thing you both have in common is COVID. You both live in COVID societies. You're both like experiencing this new set of rituals together, right?
I mean, actually being in Mexico, everyone that I meet from Canada, I know what their stance is on this whole thing as well. And we have a very similar stance on the whole thing. It's like, yeah, like I escaped and now I'm here. So yeah, it's, for better or worse, like, yeah, like we all have this thing in common. And the interesting thing is for me has been seeing how easy society can collapse, you know, like how little hold that everyone has on things, and then like how people will take advantage in whatever way, whether it's a global, like governmental level, they try to take advantage of it and see how far they can push it, or if it's on the individual level, like pushing things that don't make any sense just because you're going to get like internet points for it, or like you think it's going to boost your sexual market value.
And I think a lot of the reason why the mask mandates have continued to the point they have is because there's a large percentage of the population that would panic if there were no mask mandates. Like, they'd be scared.
Yeah, I guess it's like, when do you consider this pandemic over? Like, for us, obviously, it's been over. But, like, for a triple vaccinated person, like my father, for example, you know, he doesn't want to come down to visit in Mexico because he's like, oh, like, what's the mandates? Like, what's everything looking like? Yeah, I don't want to use my father as an example, but someone pretty much just like him, like someone who's just terrified of everything. Is like, do you really just consider this pandemic over when the government and the news tell you that it's okay? Or, you know, like, it just seems mind-boggling to me that you can't just look at the statistics and decide for yourself. You know, it's like, no, like, I have to wait until someone tells me it's okay.
It's going to be tough for a lot of people. They've rewired their brains to feel this constant hum of anxiety. And to use the religion example, it's like, as someone who was raised Catholic, if somebody walked into the church and didn't genuflect, didn't honor any of the rituals, started jumping over the benches, ran up on the altar, I'd be pretty shocked by that, right? It's like a religious person would be pretty shocked. And I think in the same way, a lot of these COVID cultists would feel shocked if they walked into a Loblaws or Walmart or whatever, and people were just showing their face and breathing normally. It's like a desecration.
And like they cough into their hand. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah,
you know?
They would be shocked and appalled.
I remember when this pandemic hit, I was in the Philippines. First, I was like visiting a friend in Australia, and then like on March 2nd, I was coming back to Manila, and the girl was like, "Hey, have you been in China recently?" And I was like, "Oh, like because of the virus?" Like, nah, don't worry about it. Like, and we laughed about it. And then I went, and then like 2 weeks later, I'm getting evacuated out of Manila, pretty much. And I remember flying out a layover to Japan, and I remember flying to there, and there's this like disgusting blob of a person right beside me, you know, like had like scabs on its elbows. Like I don't know if it's a girl or a guy. And he was just sitting there coughing the whole flight. And I was sitting there like, this is a new virus that no one's heard of. And this fucking thing is just sitting there coughing the whole time. And I was just disgusted, you know, because and I guess that's what people still are like now, you know, 2 years deep.
They don't want to be within 6 feet of another human being that doesn't have their face covered up.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing overall. Like there's, like,
it's like if you wanted to conquer a society, what would you do? You would make people fear and resent each other, cut them off from each other, and present yourself as the savior, and so and put a TV in everybody's house, so they can't go outside, but all they can do is watch your TV all day. And you teach them that contacting other human beings could kill them. Yeah. Freedom could kill them. Even just talking face to face could kill you. What's not going to kill you? Watching TV and going on Twitter.
Oh, another thing as well on top of this, Joe Rogan just did an interview, and they were talking about the obesity in children that happened over the course of these lockdowns, because everyone pretty much just got fatter. You know, they had the quarantine 15, and like obesity rates skyrocketed. speaking of like hospital capacity, that's going to be a major problem in 20 years. You know, like if we don't fix this hospital situation, we're fucked.
They have to open up private healthcare in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other choice. Like, there's not even enough money that they can still borrow to pay for the mess that they've created, you know?
Yeah.
It's funny. It's like the government has so much money for so many things, but the one thing that they've claimed a monopoly over, which is about life and death for its citizens, which is healthcare, they don't have money for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a bit of, and like they're incentivized to not have money for that.
Right. They have money to seize people's bank accounts and implement militarized police on the streets to keep people from protesting.
Mm-hmm.
That's easier to justify than actually giving people the health care they need so they
Yeah.
can live a normal life and not have to lock them down.
As well, on top of that, one of the things that I've really gotten into, and I recommend that people do, is start putting your money in crypto. Because like if you give to us, like your bank accounts being seized are now at the point of, it's like at the whim of a regime, you know? And so whatever side you're on of it, like that's the weird thing. Like you have to kind of fucking try to be a chameleon where it's like, okay, like now this is changing and this is like, where's the public sentiment blowing? Where's that wind going, you know? And that's been like the issue with the conservatives, where they're like okay, like people are on board with the mandates, like let's go on that side, you know, instead of just fucking like being authentic and having a conversation, you know. It's like, hey, like I authentically believe this and here's why. Having that conversation, it just sounds like the way out of this mess that we're in, you know.
If this society that they're creating actually continues with these mandates and bank seizures and totalitarian tyranny, the only way to survive in a society like that is to literally have zero principles, zero backbone. You're like water in a glass that's constantly changing shapes, and if you don't mold yourself to the glass, you're gonna get crushed.
Yeah.
And I don't know why anybody would voluntarily hold money in a Canadian bank account at this point. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm sure you guys are great banks before all this, but the fact that you're collaborating with this, it's like, you can't be trusted anymore.
Yeah, I was hoping actually that, like during these protests, you know, like I was hoping that sort of the army would kind of make a statement and say, hey, like we understand that there's an issue, but like we don't think it's our spot to intervene. And I think like if some police forces had done this, then that would have changed quite a few things for us, you know.
That's a good point.
And would have been even like more powerful, because it's like he's like, we're gonna sick the army on them, and like the army's like, no, you're not, you know.
I think that happened a couple times.
That was the first.
Speak out.
That was one of the things. So like in terms of, because I'm really focused on how do we change like the overall, like bring those other people onto our side. And when Doug Ford implemented that thing where like you can be stopped for any reason and pretty much asked why you're outside, and if you're outside for an unapproved reason, you get a fine. And then they're closing the parks and things like that. And then most of the police forces in Ontario said like, hey, just so you know, we're not doing this, you know. That was another moment that I saw that people like could kind of stood up and they're like, oh, the police said they're not doing that. It's like, maybe that was over the line, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that needs to happen is, and it's happening and it's starting to happen, is that these places are standing up and saying, hey, like we aren't going to, like we're not going to be implementing that, like we're not your lapdogs, like we're here to serve and protect, like we're not here to do this. So I think that's one of the things, like if the police or someone, like some kind of, I guess like a hospital too, like, hey, we're not actually going to fire the unvaccinated, you know, like all the nurses, all the doctors, like they, you know, they have, most of them have fucking, like they were heroes at the start of the pandemic. Most of them are COVID, like they have the antibodies, so like the science doesn't line up with any of the shit anymore.
That's literally what happened in the Freedom Convoy, exactly the phenomenon you're describing, with the caveat that they didn't actually speak out. Because the fact is, Trudeau had all the powers that he needed to send in the police, to beat up as many protesters as they wanted, arrest as many people. He could have called in the army without the Emergencies Act. What I heard from my sources was that the army did get called in on 2 separate occasions. They rebuked Trudeau. They basically told him to take a hike.
Yeah.
but they kept quiet about it, right? So I agree with you.
That's the issue, yeah. Because also it's like, hey, like they tried hiring those tow truck companies that are going to be doing that can pull the transport trucks, and they're like, nah, like we're not.
But then you look at these witch hunts they're implementing now to anybody who was pro Convoy now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they said we're going to hunt you down and find you and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with the Ottawa police, okay? They could have ordered the Ottawa police to go and break up a protest. They did it with the G20. They've done it with a million other protests. What I think happened was the Ottawa police, they don't want to be mandated. They don't want to facilitate fascist tyranny for the rest of human history in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't want to go brutalize a bunch of peaceful protesters who were just, their only crime was being against the mandates.
Mm-hmm.
So the government had the power to do that, but for whatever reason, they couldn't get the people to do it until they invoked this extraordinary national emergency war-like power.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're totally right, man. Wouldn't it have been great if the police chief of Ottawa, when he resigned, if he said, I have been pressured to do things that neither me nor my police chief nor my police officers want to do, namely go brutalize a bunch of peaceful protesters who have done nothing wrong. I won't do it, and I'm resigning because of that. He resigned, and then they brought in this new yes man, this like Bill Blair type thug, who basically will do anything to lick the boots of the regime in exchange for the next promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And look at Bill Blair, worst human rights abuse by police in Canadian history at the G20. This was an early red flag about Trudeau. He named him as the public justice minister back in 2015, and I think he still is.
Interesting.
So these police chiefs who prove to their authorities that they'll do anything, they'll brutalize any peaceful protester, whatever the regime says, they're the ones that get promoted.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones like Peter Slowly, they end up resigning. And he should have said something.
Yeah, that would have been ideal, and that's kind of what we need. I think at this point, like we need an because they're like, trust the science, trust the doctors. It's like only the ones that we approve, like all the virologists that don't agree with this, we're going to censor them and shit like that. But like if you have, like I think the truck unions talking about this was good. But yeah, like if you have Joel Lightbound or Lightfoot, he was a good example of this because he stepped out and they're like, oh fuck, like, okay. And then on top of that, if we could have police forces, because I know a lot of cops and they're like, this is crazy, like if they could, talk to their boss and say, hey, like, I think like we need to make a statement here, like over half of the force doesn't want to be doing this shit, like beating down people, like sending out tickets for all this stuff. I think if we had more of that, then it would do a lot to change public opinion. And on top of that, also try not to like, I fall into this, but I do consider the other side like kind of dumb sometimes, and I want to stop doing that, but then they say some shit that's pretty fucking dumb a lot. So it's tough. But yeah, I guess like in conclusion, what would you say before we wrap this up? What would you say the summary points are?
I'd say history isn't predetermined. Yes, there's powerful forces that want to take the future in a certain direction, but they can't rule without the consent of the governed. Even in this Emergencies Act, they were spraying protesters, they were beating people. But as long as more and more people kept on taking to the streets, they couldn't do anything to stop them. What ultimately broke up the protest was, yes, they shot people with tear gas. Sure, they beat people and they trampled them with horses. That made the protest smaller. But it wasn't until the temperature reached about negative 27 Celsius with the wind chill, after they had done all that, that people stopped coming out. Okay? If people just kept on coming out peacefully, they would not have been able to clear the streets of Ottawa. They would not have been able to clear the blockades of the border either.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just human willpower, and there's so much psychological warfare and people being threatened with their jobs and their insurance and their business, their bank account. You're going to get beaten, you're going to get shot. Like, look at all the pressure they had to put on people to get the numbers down. And even with that, people still kept on coming out. I don't think it would ever reach the point with social media and with the internet where the regime would be able to start shooting peaceful protesters in the street, because They would have to shoot a lot of peaceful protesters, and I don't think that would fly. I think probably at least the U.S. or some other international media would, say this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, ultimately it's just a battle of wills, and it's going to be who wants this more. Do they want to enslave us more badly than we want to be free? And that's what it's going to come down to ultimately.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for coming, bro. Appreciate
Yes,
it.
great conversation. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Absolutely.